Now, I'm going to speak tonight about the illusion of free will. And I found, to my surprise, this is actually a very sensitive subject. It's sensitive to religious people, of course, because without free will, Judaism, Christianity, Islam don't make any sense, if you can imagine such a thing. But it's also a problem for atheists. It's of concern for atheists, and it's of concern for everybody because it actually seems to touch most of what we care about in life. It seems to touch notions of moral responsibility and personal accomplishment and the criminal justice system and politics and religion. There's so much about our lives that seems to depend upon our viewing one another as conscious agents capable of making free choices. So if the scientific community were ever to declare free will an illusion, as I think it must ultimately, it would precipitate a far more acrimonious culture war than has been waged on the subject of evolution. So the stakes are high. Now, I should also say, just as a warning and point of concern, some percentage of people, I'm only now discovering this by email mostly, some percentage of people find what I'm about to say actually psychologically destabilizing. I mean, it provokes enough anxiety in them that they don't want to hear another word. Now, if you begin to feel like you're one of those people, if what I'm saying starts to feel like it's bad for you, or otherwise not compatible with mental health, by all means, go to the bar. I'll meet you at the bar later, and I will refund your ticket price. Though I'm sorry to say the salad you are eating costs $400. But seriously, I'm not trying to give anyone a nervous breakdown, so I will not take it personally if you tune me out. So I hope to do two things in this talk. I hope to convince you that free will is an illusion and that there's no way of thinking about it coherently in terms of what we now understand about the nature of reality. And I hope to persuade you that this truth matters. It actually changes something about the way we view the world, and it changes our sense, or should change our sense, of what it would mean to create a just society. Now, the popular conception of free will rests on two assumptions. The first assumption is that each of us was free to behave differently than we did in the past. If you could rewind the movie of your life to some moment 10 minutes ago or 10 hours ago, 10 years ago, you would be able to proceed differently than you did. If you chose A, you could have chosen B. If you became a firefighter, you could have become a policeman. You had chocolate ice cream, you could have chosen vanilla. It certainly seems to most of us, most of the time, that this is the universe we're living in. The second assumption is that each of us is the conscious author of our thoughts and actions. So that the part of you that thinks and perceives and experiences your life in the present moment is actually the author of your thoughts and choices and subsequent behavior. Now, the problem, unfortunately, is that we know that both of these assumptions are false. The first problem is that we live in a world of cause and effect, and either our wills are determined by a long chain of prior causes, and we're not responsible for them, or they're determined by some random influences, and we're not responsible for them. And no matter how you turn this dial between the iron law of determinism and randomness, this notion of free will doesn't make any more sense. There's no way of combining chance and determinism that makes sense of free will. And consciousness clearly is not in the driver's seat. For instance, there's now a tradition of doing experiments where you give people a very simple choice, just to push one button, the left button or the right button. And they can push whichever they want, whenever they want. And the only other task you give them is to watch a special clock where they can discriminate time in a very fine-grained way. And they just have to notice what time it was when they finally consciously made up their mind. What you find, and what the first person who did this, Benjamin Libet, did, a physiologist who had people hooked up to EEG while doing this, but it's since been replicated with functional magnetic resonance imaging and even direct recordings from the cortices of surgical patients, you find that the time at which a person consciously thinks they have consciously decided to push the left button versus the right, comes some seconds often, at minimum half a second, sometimes up to 5 seconds or 7 seconds after the brain has already decided. You can tell what the person is going to do before they know what they're going to do by looking at the brain data. Now, obviously, this gap is fundamentally hostile to the notion of free will, because this means that someone could tell what you're going to do at a point in time where you think you're still making up your mind. And people have been wrestling with these data for years, trying to collapse this interval, and some imagine that they have. I'm not persuaded by any of those results, but the truth is, even if you collapsed it totally, and the moment your brain decides was in fact the moment that you were consciously aware of deciding, there still wouldn't be room for free will. You still wouldn't know why it is you picked left over right, and you wouldn't have created the conditions of your picking. You wouldn't have tuned your brain to that precise state that led to that behavior. And this is not only objectively true. It's not just a matter that the physics of things tells us that free will doesn't make sense. I'm going to argue to you that it's subjectively true too, that there is actually no evidence of free will in our experience, which many people find quite counterintuitive. You know, what does it mean to say that someone acted of his own free will? Well, if it means anything, it must mean that he could have done otherwise. He could have behaved differently than he did. And not based on some random influences over which he had no control, but because he, as the conscious subject, was in fact the author of his actions. But the problem is no one has ever found a way of describing how physical processes could occur that would make sense of this claim. So you consider your generic murderer. They're all generic after a while, but a person's choice to commit a murder is preceded by a certain pattern of electrochemical activity in his brain, which is in turn the product of prior causes, some combination of bad genes and the developmental effects of an unhappy childhood, and then whatever is impinging on his brain in that moment. The moment we catch sight of this stream of causes, reaching back into this person's childhood and beyond, and out into the world beyond their skin, that his culpability seems to disappear. To say that he would have done otherwise, or could have done otherwise had he wanted to, is simply to say he would have been a different person had he been a different person, or he would have lived in a different universe had he lived in a different universe. And as disturbing as I might find such a person's behavior, I have to admit that if I could trade places with him, atom for atom, I would be him. I mean, there's no extra part of me that could decide to see the world differently or could decide to resist the impulse to victimize other people. And even if you believe that each of us harbors an immortal soul, this problem of responsibility remains. I cannot take credit for the fact that I don't have the soul of a psychopath.